Hi, and welcome. If you're staring down the barrel of your GCSE Edexcel History exam, specifically the Superpower Relations and the Cold War paper covering 1941 to 1991, then you, my friend, are in exactly the right place. This isn't just another dry history lesson. We're going on an intellectual expedition, a deep dive into an era that fundamentally shaped the world we live in today. Think of it as your personal training montage, but instead of push-ups, we're doing historical analysis, and instead of a championship belt, you get exam success, which arguably is even better because it involves less sweating. Over the next while, we're going to unravel the tangled web of alliances, ideologies, and near catastrophes that defined the Cold War. We'll dissect the key events, from the uneasy handshakes of wartime allies to the chilling standoffs that brought the world to the brink, and finally to the crumbling of walls and the dawn of a new, uncertain era. We'll explore the causes. Why did these superpowers, once united against a common foe, turn on each other with such suspicion and hostility? And critically, we'll examine the consequences, the ripples that spread across the globe, influencing politics, culture, and even your own life in ways you might not expect. Our mission, should you choose to accept it, and since you're revising, I'm guessing you do, is to equip you with the knowledge, the understanding, and the analytical skills to not just pass your exam, but to absolutely ace it. We're talking about understanding the nuances, connecting the dots, and articulating your arguments with confidence. So grab your notebook, sharpen your pencils, or, open a new document, and let's get ready to understand the complexities of a conflict that was anything but cold for those who lived through it. Let's begin. So, picture this. World War II is raging and an unlikely trio bands together. We've got the capitalist USA, the Imperial UK, and the communist USSR forming what's known as the Grand Alliance. Their common enemy, the Axis powers, primarily Nazi Germany. It's a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but let's be clear, this friendship was always more of a strategic necessity than a heartfelt camaraderie. They cooperated, sharing intelligence, coordinating military strategies, and celebrating victories. But beneath the surface, the ideological fault lines were already there, like cracks in a foundation just waiting for the pressure to build. The USA and UK championed democracy and capitalism, while the USSR was all about communism and state control. These aren't just minor disagreements over economic policy, they're fundamentally different ways of seeing the world and organizing society. This initial period, from 1941, saw them fighting on the same side, but the seeds of mistrust were sown early and often. The USSR was deeply suspicious of its Western allies, believing they deliberately delayed opening a second front in Western Europe to weaken the Soviet Union, which bore the brunt of the fighting against Germany on the Eastern Front for years. Conversely, the Western allies, while needing Soviet help, were wary of the USSR's post-war ambitions, particularly concerning Eastern Europe. So, even as they fought together, they were already thinking about the shape of the world after the war, and their visions were starkly different. This uneasy alliance, forged in the crucible of war, was always destined to be a temporary, fragile thing, a prelude to a much longer, much colder conflict. February 1945. The war in Europe is grinding towards its end, and the big three, Roosevelt for the USA, Churchill for the UK, and Stalin for the USSR, meet at Yalta in the Crimea. The mood? Cautiously optimistic, but also freighted with the immense task of deciding the fate of post-war Europe. They managed to agree on some pretty significant things, at least on paper. Germany, they decided, would be divided into 4 occupation zones, one each for the USA, UK, USSR, and France. Berlin, deep within the Soviet zone, would also be similarly divided. This was a pragmatic solution to managing a defeated Germany, but as we'll see, it became a major flashpoint. Crucially, they also agreed to the formation of the United Nations, an organization intended to prevent future global conflicts. A noble goal, certainly. Perhaps the most contentious agreement, or at least the one that would unravel most spectacularly, concerned Eastern Europe. Stalin pledged to allow free and fair elections in the countries liberated by the Red Army, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. For Roosevelt and Churchill, this was a key principle, upholding the ideal of self-determination. However, Stalin's interpretation of free elections and friendly governments on his western border was, shall we say, rather different from the Western understanding. He was determined to create a buffer zone of Soviet-friendly states to protect the USSR from future invasions from the West. This fundamental disagreement over the future of Eastern Europe, papered over with diplomatic language at Yalta, would soon erupt into open hostility. Yalta, in many ways, was the calm before the storm. Fast forward just 5 months to July 1945. The setting is Potsdam, Germany, another meeting of the Big Three. But the dynamics had shifted dramatically. For starters, Roosevelt had died and was replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was far more suspicious of Stalin and less inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. Also, during the conference, Churchill was voted out of office and replaced by Clement Attlee. So, two of the original three were new to these high-stakes negotiations, and perhaps most significantly, just before the conference began, Truman received word that the USA had successfully tested an atomic bomb. This new, terrifying weapon fundamentally altered the balance of power and gave Truman a newfound confidence, or perhaps arrogance, in his dealings with Stalin. The disagreements that had simmered beneath the surface at Yalta now boiled over. Reparations from Germany were a major sticking point. Stalin wanted to cripple Germany economically to ensure it could never threaten the USSR again, while Truman and Attlee, wary of repeating the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, wanted a more measured approach. The future of Poland was another sore spot, with disagreements over its borders and the composition of its government. Truman confronted Stalin directly about the lack of free elections in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, but Stalin was unmoved. The atomic bomb, while not explicitly used as a bargaining chip, loomed over the proceedings, a silent testament to America's new military might and a source of deep concern for Stalin. Potsdam, unlike Yalta, ended not with a sense of shared purpose, but with a chilling realization that the wartime alliance was well and truly over. After Potsdam, Stalin wasted little time in consolidating Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, creating what would become known as the Eastern Bloc. This wasn't an overnight invasion in most cases. Rather, it was a gradual, methodical process often described by opponents as salami tactics, slicing away opposition bit by bit until communist parties, backed by Moscow and often supported by the presence of the Red Army, held total power. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia, which had been liberated from Nazi Germany by Soviet forces, found themselves trading one form of external control for another. Elections were held, but they were rarely free or fair, with opposition parties suppressed, intimidated or outright banned. Key government positions, interior, defense, communications, were invariably filled by communists. From the Soviet perspective, this was about security. Russia had been invaded from the West multiple times, most devastatingly by Napoleon and then Hitler. Creating a buffer zone of friendly, ideologically aligned states seemed like a rational defensive measure to prevent future aggression. Stalin saw it as his right, a reward for the immense sacrifices the Soviet Union had made in defeating Nazism. However, from the Western perspective, particularly the USA and UK, this looked like aggressive expansionism, a clear violation of the Yalta agreements and a terrifying confirmation of their fears about the spread of communism. It was seen as a direct threat to democratic values and the stability of post-war Europe. This establishment of Soviet-dominated satellite states was a crucial step in transforming ideological differences into a concrete geopolitical divide. By 1946, the growing divide was undeniable. In March of that year, Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister but still a hugely influential figure, gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, USA. In it, he famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This Iron Curtain metaphor powerfully captured the reality of Europe's division, a West that was largely democratic and capitalist, and an East increasingly under the tight grip of Soviet-controlled communist regimes, largely cut off from its Western neighbours. Churchill's speech wasn't just an observation, it was a call to action, urging the Western powers, particularly the United States, to stand firm against Soviet expansionism. While some criticized it as warmongering, it resonated deeply with many in the West who shared his concerns. A year later, in March 1947, President Truman took a decisive step that formalized this stance. Facing communist insurgencies in Greece and Soviet pressure on Turkey, Truman went before the US Congress and announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In practical terms, this meant providing $400 million in military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. But its significance was far broader. It was a global commitment to contain communism, to prevent its spread beyond the areas where it already existed. The Truman Doctrine marked a fundamental shift in American foreign policy from isolationism to active global interventionism, and set the stage for decades of Cold War confrontation. The ideological battle lines were now clearly and very publicly drawn. Following hot on the heels of the Truman Doctrine, and very much a part of this strategy of containment, came the Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program. Announced by US Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, this was an ambitious and frankly incredibly generous economic aid package for war-torn Europe. Think about it, Europe was devastated. Cities were rubble, economies were shattered, infrastructure was destroyed, and people were starving. Such conditions, the Americans feared, were a fertile breeding ground for communism. Desperate people might turn to radical ideologies, and the US wanted to prevent that, especially in strategically important Western European countries. So, the Marshall Plan offered billions of dollars, ultimately around $13 billion, which is a colossal sum, especially back then, to help European nations rebuild. The aid wasn't just handed out with no strings attached, though. Countries receiving it had to agree to certain economic reforms and cooperate with each other, fostering greater European economic integration. While the offer was technically extended to all European countries, including those in the Soviet sphere of influence, the conditions were such that Stalin and the Eastern Bloc countries rejected it. Stalin saw it as dollar imperialism, an American attempt to undermine Soviet influence and bring Eastern Europe into the capitalist camp. In response, the Soviets established their own, much less well-funded economic organization called Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, in 1949 for the Eastern Bloc. The Marshall Plan was a resounding success in Western Europe, fueling rapid economic recovery, stabilizing democratic governments, and solidifying the Western alliance against the Soviet Union. It also, of course, created strong markets for American goods. Now we come to one of the first major flashpoints of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade and airlift. Remember how Germany and Berlin itself were divided into 4 occupation zones? Well, by 1948, the Western powers, the USA, UK, and France decided to merge their zones in West Germany and introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark, to help stimulate economic recovery. Stalin saw this as a direct threat, a step towards creating a strong, independent West German state aligned with the West right on his doorstep. His response was dramatic and dangerous. In June 1948, Soviet forces blockaded all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, which, remember, was an enclave deep within the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. The goal was clear: to starve West Berlin into submission and force the Western Allies to abandon their plans for West Germany, or even abandon West Berlin itself. The Western Allies faced a stark choice: give in to Stalin, try to break the blockade militarily, risking all-out war, or find another way. They chose an audacious third option, a massive airlift. For nearly a year, from June 1948 to May 1949, American, British, and other Allied planes flew round-the-clock missions, delivering food, fuel, medicine, and all other essential supplies to the over 2 million beleaguered citizens of West Berlin. It was an incredible logistical feat, a symbol of Western resolve, and a huge propaganda victory. Eventually realizing the blockade was failing and was actually damaging Soviet prestige, Stalin lifted it in May 1949. The crisis had profound consequences. It accelerated the formal division of Germany into West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, German Democratic Republic, and it was a key catalyst for the formation of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in April 1949, a military alliance designed to protect Western Europe from Soviet aggression. The Cold War was now truly entrenched. Fast forward to October 1962, and the world held its breath during what many consider the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It all started when American U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba discovered evidence that the Soviet Union was secretly installing medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles on the island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Why would Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, do this? Well, several reasons: to protect Fidel Castro's communist Cuba from another US invasion, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, to counter American missiles stationed in Turkey, which were very close to the USSR, and generally to try and shift the strategic balance of power. But for US President John F. Kennedy and his advisors, these missiles represented an unacceptable and immediate threat. For 13 incredibly tense days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy's team, known as ExComm, debated options ranging from an immediate airstrike and invasion of Cuba, which likely would have triggered a full-scale war, to diplomatic pressure. Kennedy ultimately opted for a naval quarantine, a blockade, but quarantine sounded less aggressive, around Cuba to prevent further Soviet ships from delivering missile components. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations took place. Eventually, a deal was struck. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public US pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret US agreement to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis was a terrifying lesson in brinkmanship, the art of pushing a dangerous situation to the verge of disaster to achieve one's aims. It scared both sides so much that it led to efforts to reduce nuclear tensions, including the establishment of a hotline direct communication link between Washington and Moscow. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers recognized the terrifying potential for mutual destruction. This, combined with economic pressures and a desire for greater stability, led to a period in the 1970s known as Détente, a French word meaning a relaxation of tensions. It wasn't the end of the Cold War by any means, but it was a significant shift in tone and policy. Leaders like US President Richard Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev actively sought to manage their rivalry and reduce the risk of direct conflict. One of the most significant achievements of Détente was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. SALT I, signed in 1972, included agreements to limit the number of anti-ballistic missile (ABM) sites each country could have, and to freeze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) and submarine-launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs) at current levels. Another key moment was the Helsinki Accords in 1975. 35 nations, including the USA, USSR, and most European countries, signed these accords. They had three main baskets: security issues, recognizing existing European borders, which was a big deal for the Soviets, cooperation in economics, science and technology, and, crucially, human rights. While the Soviets were less keen on the human rights provisions, they signed anyway, and these provisions later became a rallying point for dissidents in Eastern Europe. Détente also saw increased trade and cultural exchanges. However, this thaw proved to be temporary. Underlying suspicions remained, and events like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 shattered the fragile understanding. The US, under President Carter and later Reagan, saw this as a blatant act of aggression, and Détente effectively came to an end, ushering in a new period of heightened Cold War tension. And so we arrive at one of the most iconic moments, not just of the Cold War, but of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. This wasn't just about bricks and mortar. The Berlin Wall was the ultimate symbol of the Iron Curtain, of a divided Europe, and of communist oppression. Its sudden, almost unbelievable demise signaled the beginning of the end for communism in Eastern Europe, and ultimately the Cold War itself. How did it happen? Well, it wasn't a single event, but the culmination of various pressures. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of openness and economic restructuring had unintentionally unleashed forces he couldn't control. He also signaled that the USSR would no longer use military force to keep communist regimes in Eastern Europe propped up. The so-called Sinatra Doctrine, they could do it their way. This emboldened reform movements across the Eastern Bloc. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape to the west. Mass protests erupted in East German cities like Leipzig. The East German government, facing overwhelming pressure and a crisis of legitimacy, fumbled. On that fateful evening, a government spokesman mistakenly announced that East Germans would be free to travel to the west immediately. Thousands flocked to the border crossings in Berlin, and overwhelmed guards, unsure what to do, eventually opened the gates. The scenes that followed were extraordinary. Joyous East and West Berliners dancing on the wall, chipping away at it with hammers and chisels. It was a powerful televised demonstration that the old order was collapsing. The fall of the Berlin Wall didn't the end of the Cold War, but it was its most potent symbol and a critical accelerator of the process. And there you have it, a whirlwind tour through some of the most pivotal moments of superpower relations in the Cold War. From the uneasy alliances of World War II to the symbolic collapse of the Berlin Wall, it's a narrative packed with tension, ideology, and profound human drama. As you gear up for your GCSE exam, remember that knowing the chronology, what happened when, is absolutely crucial. But history isn't just a list of dates. It's about understanding the intricate dance of causes and consequences. Why did these events happen? What were their immediate impacts? And what were their long-term legacies? Being able to articulate these connections is key. Practice explaining the importance of these key events. Think about how you'd structure a narrative account, telling the story of, say, the Berlin airlift or the Cuban Missile Crisis in a clear and analytical way. And get comfortable with the terminology. Words like containment, détente, brinkmanship, doctrine, and arms race aren't just buzzwords. They are concepts that unlock a deeper understanding of the period. Compare and contrast the attitudes and policies of key leaders. How did Truman's approach differ from Stalin's? What were the dynamics between Reagan and Gorbachev that helped bring the Cold War to a close? These comparisons will really elevate your analysis. Ultimately, the Cold War shaped the geopolitical landscape we inhabit today, and understanding it is more relevant than ever. We've covered a lot, but this is your launchpad. Dive deeper, ask critical questions, and connect the events into a coherent narrative. Good luck with your revision. We genuinely hope this has helped you on your journey to acing that exam. And hey, if you're looking for printable notes, flashcards, or even a quiz to test your newfound knowledge, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to be awesome, and we'll see you next time.